more talks on this on a regular basis for the rest of the year. The next talk will be in 2 weeks' time, which will look at why shipping was left out of the Paris Agreement. Then after the summer, the northern summer, we'll be having talks around issues such as 3D printing, carbon pricing, and other informative and interesting topics. But our topic today is resource efficiency. And the OECD has been doing a lot of work in this area in the last decade, and we have recently produced a major policy guidance which was delivered to the G7 Environment Ministers meeting last month. Resource efficiency is key to improving the economic, environmental and social development of our economies, and it's very important to have a holistic and well-based approach to how we improve the resource efficiency in our economies. To take us through that today, I'd like to introduce Peter Borky, who is a senior analyst in the Environment Directorate and is the lead author of this report that went to the G7. So now I'll pass it over to Peter, who will talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll field questions from both the audience here at the OECD and on the from the web participants. So Peter.
Thank you, Anthony, and well, I guess good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, because I suspect people are probably here from all over the world connected to this event electronically. So Anthony has already given a nice introduction, so that reduces the amount of sort of introductory talk that I need to do. Maybe let me just say, in addition to sort of the political the political interest that Anthony has highlighted in the framework of the G7, that governments have become increasingly interested in resource efficiency for a number of reasons. I guess interest was sparked off at the height of the commodities boom, and when commodity prices were reaching very high levels, a lot of government, some countries were also beginning to put trade restrictions into place to keep some of the commodities back home. I think that sparked off discussion about resource security, resource scarcity, and in addition to that, obviously a discussion around the environmental effects that are generated by the resource consumption. And I think more recently then, and Anthony mentioned the G7 initiative on resource efficiency. Some countries, certainly those of the G7, have seen resource efficiency as an opportunity to actually improve competitiveness also. So you can see it's an issue and a policy question or a policy area that reaches into many different areas. So let me get started with my PowerPoint presentation. This is the outline of what I will be presenting. My presentation is in 4 parts. I want to start by giving you some key trends in resource efficiency, then move on to discussing some of the key policy trends that we've seen over the last years, and then move into a discussion of some of the policy guidance or some highlights of the policy guidance that we have produced for the G7 very recently, and finally finish off with some conclusions. So key trends in resource efficiency. Let me put up this graph sort of to get us started. These graphs show material consumption and GDP for the OECD and the world. On the right-hand side, you can see how material extraction has been increasing over essentially the past 30 years, more or less in line with GDP, even though slightly slower.
That's real GDP?
That's real GDP.
I mean, not nominal. Real as opposed to nominal.
That's real GDP, yes. Yeah. And so what you can see here is kind of relative decoupling, where we're using globally a little bit less material per unit of GDP. But what you can also see is that essentially over the last 30 years, our use of material has essentially doubled. So that's the worldwide picture in the OECD. While GDP has also increased, material consumption has essentially leveled off and even decreased in the past few years, even though it remains to be seen how much of that dip that you can see starting in 2007, 2008, roughly, is actually linked to the economic and financial crisis, and how material consumption might actually pick up again once economic growth becomes more sustained. So I think the story here is that in the OECD, absolute material consumption is actually now decreasing. So we have what we call absolute decoupling, at least for a few years now, and it remains to be seen how this will evolve in the future. However, while we have a relatively positive story there for the OECD, there are a few caveats to that. First of all, in the OECD, we consume significantly more resources per capita than in the rest of the world. 46 kilograms per person and per day in the OECD. Just imagine, I mean, it's a huge amount of resources. 50 kilos is almost impossible to carry, and that's per day. And globally, this is 29 kilos per person per day. So it is significantly more, roughly, what is it, 50% more that we consume in the OECD. Another caveat comes when you look actually in a different way at material consumption. And when we take so-called hidden material flows into account. So the hidden material flows comprise materials that are necessary to produce imports and exports, and which are usually not accounted for when you look domestically at material consumption. And so when you take this more consumption-based material consumption perspective, then you actually see that we consume significantly more material per capita than with a domestic material consumption measure, which is a more production-based measure. And so the average in the OECD, which is essentially 17 tons per capita per year, then becomes double, 34 tons per capita and per year. So, the progress that we have achieved in decoupling our material consumption is also in part linked to the offshoring of some very material-intensive production processes and imports then of the products that have been essentially produced through those products abroad. We also have achieved some some progress downstream in the area of waste management. These graphs here show the evolution of municipal solid waste that's generated, and again, this is this is the blue line on the left-hand side, and this is plotted against GDP again. And the gray line is the waste that is municipal waste that is landfilled. So what you can see here again is a kind of decoupling. The production or the generation of municipal solid waste is leveling off and even decreasing now very slightly over the last few years. Again, there's a question, how much the economic crisis is actually responsible for this. And economic growth continuing. And on the right-hand side, you can see how the way that we the way that we deal with municipal solid waste has also evolved with a very significant decrease in landfill and a significant increase in material recovery or recycling, which has increased from roughly 19% of municipal solid waste 20 years back to 33% now. So I think that at least explains a very small part of what you've seen in material consumption. We are using less virgin material and are relying more on recycling and recovering material from the waste flow. So that is sort of a quantitative story of where we stand with resource efficiency. And now I'm going to say a few things about what we've seen on the policy front and how policy has evolved and some of the challenges, particularly that still remain. So first of all, I think it's been very clear and apparent that, and I said that already before, that countries have become increasingly interested in resource efficiency policies and have been taking action to enshrine resource efficiency in their policy approaches and packages. There are now a significant number of countries which have some sort of resource efficiency policy or strategy as part of green growth or circular economy or sustainable development strategies. Just to name a few, I mean, Japan has the 3R policies, which stands for reduce, reuse, and recycle. And Japan is conducting those policies in the framework of its sound material cycle policy since the early 2000s, essentially. So it's been a long-term effort there already. In the European Union, a circular economy package has just been put on the way of further consultation and should result in further strengthening of policies in the EU region. In the United States, there's a strategic plan on sustainable materials management to 2022 that has been adopted recently. And in China, circular economy is part of the 5-year plans for at least 15 years, as far as I know. So there, there is political attention. There's the G7 initiative, which we already talked about. However, what we see also is that actually there's been a lot of attention given to waste management, to sort of the downstream parts of the resource efficiency story, or the last of the 3 Rs, as opposed to the first two, reduce and reuse, and much less attention spent upstream. So that's the first caveat. I think another positive development is actually that countries have been increasingly using economic instruments in the policy portfolio, and you can see that, and I will say a few words later on about that. With respect to landfill taxes and incineration taxes, the use of so-called pay-as-you-throw charging for household waste, where households essentially pay as a function of the volume or mass of waste, the weight of waste that they generate, which provides incentives to reduce waste and prevent waste. And then the use also of extended producer responsibility policies, where producers are responsible for the financing and sometimes also the organization of the collection and treatment of waste at the end of life. So these are some positive developments. As you can see, the positive developments in the use of economic instruments are really concentrated at the end of life, very much. But there are also a number of persistent challenges, and I think one of maybe the most important ones is that the policy landscape for resource efficiency is almost by necessity very fragmented. We're dealing here with a great variety of different materials, products, different life cycles, stages, and market players. And that really requires, a lot of different policies and policy instruments to come into play. So the complexity from the policy perspective of what we're dealing with here is really relatively high. Given this complexity, there's always a risk that policy action, rather than actually, improving the environment overall, is simply resulting in a shift of environmental burden from one life cycle stage to the next, or from one environmental medium to the next. So that's proven to be a very important challenge, and therefore it's important to really look at the policies in sort of conjunction through the perspective of a carefully designed policy mix that pursues a number of objectives on different materials and different life cycle stages, and that fit together. And another challenge is that despite the attention that resource efficiency has received over the last years, there's still a fairly important lack of integration of resource efficiency and mainstreaming of resource efficiency into other policy areas. And I think there are many sectoral policies which are quite strongly linked to resource efficiency. Just think about agriculture, think about transport, or chemicals, which maybe fewer people are aware about, but chemicals policies provide, say, for they influence the opportunities that exist in terms of recovering material and feeding them back into the economy. So with that sort of background about the key trends in our use of materials and the sort of policy landscape, let me then come to some of the key recommendations that we are providing in this publication that Anthony has already mentioned. I think Anthony said everything that is here on the slide, maybe apart from the fact that the report was presented in a environment ministers G7 environment ministers meeting in Japan just about a month ago. let me also say maybe that this work was done relatively quickly, and it draws on a lot of past work across different different parts of the EPOC, the Environmental Policy Committee, but also other parts of the House, and so it the policy recommendations that we'll be talking about in just a minute are really grounded in many years of work here at the OECD in the area of green growth, in the environmental policy area, on sustainable materials management, etc. So the report essentially comes up with 4 key messages, and there's sort of, you could already sense them in what I was saying before, I guess. So there's a message to apply mixes of policy instruments to take account of the diversity and complexity of the resource efficiency area, to take a whole of life cycle perspective, so as to avoid that environmental pressures are simply shifted around rather than reduced, to integrate resource efficiency into sectoral and cross-cutting policies, as I've already said, and finally to strengthen monitoring, evaluation, and data, which is a real weak spot in this area, where data is notoriously weak and insufficient. I will now go into 3 of these, the 3 first ones actually, and try and illustrate them a little bit through a number of examples. So here, this is a graph that shows how our member countries are using landfill taxes. I mean, I think China is also on the slide, but it's mostly OECD member countries. What is interesting to see here is the increase of the use of landfill taxes across our membership. I think the number of countries that use landfill taxes essentially increased 5-fold over the last 15 years. And also the level of those landfill taxes increased, very significantly, as well, as you cannot see here from this slide. But most countries have, in fact, that use landfill taxes have, in fact, increased the tax rates quite significantly. And we have now some countries such as Austria, the Netherlands, and Belgium, which have landfill tax rates which are above 80 euros per ton, which is very significant and leads to significant diversion of waste from landfill. Countries usually differentiate the taxes according to the type of waste. So these very high rates actually apply to material that could also be recycled, so where there's still a value and where there could be other ways of treating it, while waste, which is clearly recognized as sort of residual and without value and without opportunities for recovery, gets much lower tax rates. I think landfill taxes are sort of a key element in the policy mix downstream, because it closes down the sort of lowest cost disposal route, which is usually landfill, and then creates opportunities for other treatment methods, be it energy recovery or material recovery. And you can really see how the use of restrictive policies on landfill then lead to much higher material and energy recovery results. Here this graph doesn't show all OECD countries. It basically picks sort of the top performers and the lower performers, and then essentially has the largest economies stuck in between. But what you can see is that for Switzerland, which applies, let me check, which essentially applies a landfill ban for certain materials, and then also has a landfill tax of about 40 euros per capita. They have virtually eliminated landfill through that route, and a number of the other sort of front-runner countries, such as Germany and Japan, are achieving similar results in terms of diminishing landfill rates. But what you also can see is that there is a significant additional potential which is in the OECD, which is due to the fact that we have a huge disparity in performances here across countries. I think I should probably speed up a little bit as I'm looking at the watch. So I think the interesting story here is countries are using more economic instruments, especially sort of downstream, for end-of-life management and waste management. But when you look upstream, then at the policies, for instance, that are used for waste prevention, so for reducing actually the amount of materials that we use, for reusing products and materials, well, rather products, so as to extend their useful lives. Then you see that here the policy landscape is actually very much dominated by what one could call soft instruments, such as information-based policy instruments, which seek to inform and encourage and raise awareness, while the use of economic and regulatory instruments is less intense. But some countries are now taking measures to change that, and France has just, I think, a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago now, passed a so-called energy transition law, which has a chapter on circular economy in it, and which sort of provides for a number of regulatory actions to improve waste prevention and sort of address the upstream parts of the circular economy by, for instance, measures to extend the useful life of products, by extending the minimum warranty periods, by requiring minimum duration of availability of spare parts, and by labeling, obligatory labeling of expected lifetime of products. So there's some change in the making here, which should be very interesting to see how effective it is. On the life cycle approach, I think here, there are a number of instruments which allow to sort of take a life cycle approach. There's green public procurement as one. There are sort of more voluntary approaches in the form of partnerships, public-private partnerships, to improve supply chain management that are being used in a number of countries. And there is extended producer responsibility, which I already alluded to a little bit earlier. I think extended producer responsibility is an interesting tool because it really takes a whole of life cycle perspective by connecting producers to the management of products at the end of life, and it provides them with a price signal to factor that into their into the product design and the production processes. It's also been a very successful policy tool in the OECD, but also beyond. There are now more than 400 such schemes in operation, and you know, a lot of countries now use them, especially for e-waste, electronic and electric waste, as well as for packaging, end-of-life vehicles. Probably the areas where these tools are adopted and used most frequently. France is sort of the champion of expanded producer responsibility and uses the approach for 14 different product categories, including such things as furniture and textiles. And so I think the approach has been relatively successful, and we just completed a major piece of work that analyzes the expanded producer responsibility policies across a variety of countries. What this work shows is that these policies have been very successful at generating resources to finance separate collection and increase material recovery rates. And they have been very complementary to such policies as landfill taxes. But they have also shown to be, demonstrating very disparate performance in both recycling rates and costs, which is a concern to policymakers in a lot of countries. And they have been disappointing in the way that they have actually incentivized producers to improve product design for a number of reasons, which I unfortunately don't have time to go into here. But we now have updated guidance on the design of EPR, which is available, and which tries to provide, you know, some helpful guidance on how EPR policies can now be strengthened. And these are going to be my last couple of slides. So the third area or key message from our publication is about the need for policy alignment and integration. As you can see here, I mean, climate and resource efficiency sort of overlap with a number of policies, fiscal policies, competition policies, trade, development, investment. It's all linked. It all links into these. As I said before, I mean, for the moment, I think relatively little attention has actually been spent in mainstreaming resource efficiency into those policy areas and correcting misalignments where they exist, and sort of achieving greater level of coherence across the board. And just to give one example, we and I have a colleague here who works on this right now. There are still quite a few public support measures directed at mining of minerals in a lot of countries, and you know, it's a similar story as on fossil fuels, and these tend to distort you know, the economic picture and incentives for the use and of recycled and secondary materials and the development of recycling activities. But we're also talking here about innovation policies which have received very little or have put very little attention on resource efficiency so far. Trade is another area where some misalignments are apparent. The OECD, the Trade Committee in the OECD has conducted some research that developed an inventory of export restrictions on industrial raw materials. And what this work shows is that about 50% of the export restrictions that could be identified actually focus on secondary materials. Again, these are then obstacles to closing loops in the most optimal way, closing material loops in the most optimal way. Now, what some countries have been doing, some of the front-runner countries, is to address this, is that they have set up governance arrangements to identify misalignments and then address them. So, for instance, Finland and the Netherlands have put in place an overarching central body to coordinate resource productivity policies. France has a circular economy roadmap that also supports better coordination across policy areas. And I think a very interesting example actually comes from the climate change and is the way that the United Kingdom implemented its coordination mechanism for climate change, which has very long-term objectives that sort of go beyond electoral cycles and are independently reviewed. So that's a way that allows then all the sectoral ministries to focus and to adapt and adjust to these mechanisms. So to conclude, and sorry for being slightly longer than what I said, I think resource efficiency is still a very important challenge, and a lot more actually needs to be done to reverse the current trends. There's a need to focus efforts much more on upstream of end-of-life product policies, product design policies in particular seem very relevant. There is a need to further strengthen the use of economic instruments in the policy mix, to use a whole-of-life cycle approach where it's feasible, and to better integrate resource efficiency policies with sectoral and cross-cutting policies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and that's a very thorough examination of how the work in OECD on resource efficiency is laid out. We have time for questions, so questions from the floor to start with, and then we'll see if there's any questions coming in over the web. So Ron and then Katia. So press the button.
Hi, very interesting, thank you. I'm Ron Steenblick from the Trade and Agriculture Directorate. I had one question about, I think that you said that some countries charge a higher landfill tax the higher the value that the waste stream has for reuse. Perhaps being a bit of the devil's advocate here, but I don't really understand the logic of that. One would think that if there was a value for its reuse, that should be the signal we should be relying on. If, on the other hand, there's a environmental problem caused by landfill, then one would have some kind of fee proportional to that. But I don't understand a fee proportional to the value of its use elsewhere.
Thanks for the question, Ron. I think I wasn't clear enough, maybe. So, for instance, what a lot of countries do is that they put a very high landfill tax on organic biodegradable waste, because, well, when this is put into a landfill and it degrades, it produces methane, which is, a greenhouse gas, very important one. And there are, a lot of other ways of treating organic waste, such as through composting, which are available. And but basically, the landfill tax in this case serves to incentivize separate collection of organic material, which has a, I mean, separate collection unfortunately has a very high cost.
So I misheard that it is not charging it proportional to the value.
No, I mean,
okay.
That's what I wanted to say is charging is usually linked to whether there are opportunities to use that technological opportunities to use that material otherwise, and to the sort of environmental impacts that it generates in the landfill. So on the organic waste, that is very clear. Plastics is another example. Countries usually tax plastic waste that appears in landfills very, very highly because it can be used in incineration facilities to recover energy, and it can also be recycled and material can be recovered. But the price signal needs to be very high so as to make the actual collection and treatment actually economically feasible.
Just to follow up on that, but go to Katja's first. When you have a high tax on something like bottles, don't you also risk, though, people not putting it into the formal waste stream, but basically just littering with it or throwing it out elsewhere? Certainly in a lot of countries it seems to be the case.
Yes, I mean that is an issue, but I mean it. Oh, okay, yeah. Should be looking to the side. So that is an issue, but it can be addressed, and in most countries where you have very high landfill taxes or even landfill bans for certain types of waste, littering is fairly well under control. What you need to have is a system that enforces fines on offenders and essentially discourages littering effectively. Plus the infrastructure also that allows people to dispose of waste in the most practical way for them.
Thanks, Peter. Really very comprehensive and very encouraging to see all the uptake in some of the policy instruments. Would you say that perhaps one of the reasons or impetus for that was there not an EU landfill directive that imposed severe penalties and fines for landfill excess? That's one question. Just to try and better understand what encourages the uptake of these kinds of policies. It was also very interesting to see the variety in the taxes and the tax rates, and really impressive, like 80 euro, I think you said, per ton. Why do you think it varies so much across the countries? Like, why have some countries been able to implement such high taxes and others are still at such a lower level? And then just a clarification question, is energy recovery, is that incineration? And I'm wondering, I believe that there was lack of clarity, perhaps, if that's the right word, with regard to the environmental costs of landfill versus incineration. And I'm curious, you had the increase in, or sort of rather decrease in landfill and increase in recycling, in a sense. Where does incineration fit into that figure? So sorry for the multiple questions, but it's very interesting.
Okay. Well, thanks for the question. Let me go back to my slide here. So I think what you can see here on the slide, so I'm starting with your last question about landfill versus incineration. And so what you can see here on the slide, in blue, this is landfill. In light blue, this is material recovery. And in gray, it's energy recovery. So, in fact, when you have high landfill taxes, as is the case in Switzerland, for instance, then you divert some of the waste into energy recovery and some into material recovery. Yes, and well, I mean, energy recovery can also be, achieved in other ways through anaerobic digesters, for instance, and the production of methane, which can then, be used for heating or even injected, as is the case in some countries, into the gas distribution system. But I mean, mostly, I think these are large-scale waste incinerators, as well as facilities that use so-called refuse-derived fuel, so which is essentially waste which is made available to thermal systems such as cement kilns. So it's a mix of different technologies for energy recovery. Now I forget your first question. Sorry. All right. Yeah.
Is stronger in some countries, at least when you look at the tax levels.
Apologies to those who are connected through Wi-Fi, through internet. I mean, the EC sort of does, through its Waste Framework Directive and the Landfill Directive, encourage, landfill diversion. And I think in the new, I can't recall exactly, in the new circular economy package, I think there's also a landfill reduction target included. So clearly for European countries, the use of landfill taxes is at least partly motivated by the European policies in this area. Now, why are they using different tax rates? It's simply because countries are pursuing different objectives. So some countries go way beyond the objectives that are sort of mandated by the EU. And such as Germany, which has a landfill ban for recoverable and recyclable material, and other countries do have different starting points also, and are gradually sort of building up their policies in this area. So just thinking of the Eastern European newer members of the European Union, where essentially still 95% of the waste is landfilled. So in order to sort of manage the financial capacities and allow sort of the build-up of an infrastructure, you want to do this quite gradually, such as did the United Kingdom, that had a sort of landfill tax escalator that was set out over a 15-year time frame or something like that. And that provided a clear sense of where the government wanted economic actors to go.
Difference between the environmental and health costs between landfill versus incineration, if you're aware.
The difference, well, I mean, the impact, the sort of health and environmental impacts of sort of state-of-the-art facilities are fairly well controlled. So the impacts are relatively minimal in these cases, but it's clear that while incineration is producing most of its impact through air as a medium, landfill actually the impact is mostly through soils and water. So that's as much as I can say.
Thanks, Peter. Question over here, and then we'll take a couple of questions from the audience on the net.
Thank you, Peter, for the report and very good presentation. First, to clarify, when we talk about minerals, for instance, for copper, you need to get 1 ton of copper to remove 100 of ton of, and you have figures for different minerals. Are those materials taken into account in this report also, or this is a matter of other budget, material budget? And my other question is, if we want to reach the Paris Agreement 2 degrees Celsius, and when you see the figures that material use in the current trends will double from now to 2050, what are the real prospects to stabilize the material consumption, or to have a real absolute decoupling? Because I think, I guess, we need effectively to reduce or stabilize and then reduce the use of material, because all these materials need energy to extract, process, transport, and so on. So, and what are the good success histories that could be applied elsewhere, taking into account different realities in developed and developing countries?
So the first graph that I showed, I don't know if we can bring this up. This is about your question, is sort of the overburden that is produced when you extract a ton of copper. Is this reflected in the numbers? Now, let me just go to that slide here. So here in those numbers, which show domestic material extraction, those would not be represented, because any unused extraction is typically not represented in those numbers. But they would be represented here in what we call the hidden flows. But here information is still a bit more patchy. So it's more complex to actually generate these numbers. Now, what about your other question is it actually possible to limit the increase in material use, and are there any success stories? And can we actually prevent material use from doubling in the next 40 years or so? I don't have the answer. It's a subject of intense debate among scientists. We're trying to see from what level of GDP per capita actually material consumption begins to level off, and actually research shows that there's a kind of Kuznets curve of material consumption depending on per capita GDP levels. Essentially, what seems to be relatively clear is that countries that are building up their urban infrastructure and that are urbanizing very fast, such as places like China and India, they have a very intense need and use of materials. And it is probably difficult to see how that can be prevented entirely. But it's also clear that when you look at OECD countries, most of which are relatively mature in their economic development and urbanization and the infrastructure that they have, that there are huge differences in per capita material consumption between these countries. So a country like Japan is more resource efficient by several times. I can't remember exactly, it's factor 3 or 4 than the United States. So the way you organize your infrastructure, the way urbanization takes place, sort of has a significant impact on resource efficiency in the end of the day. And so I think this is where policy can intervene and steer things. Okay.
We do have a couple of questions, or we have a lot of questions from participants in the webinar. We might just have time for one or two. The first one is from, we'll take this from Sarah Shapiro-Bengtson, who's asking, in the decoupling of GDP from material consumption, which is decoupling of GDP from material consumption is related to the weight of materials. How do we deal with the nature of different materials, for example, their scarcity and recyclability? And a second question, which you might want to answer, touch on, is how do we create incentives to use materials that are suitable for recovery, not just once, but several times? Use, reuse, and reuse again. Maybe you can touch on those two quickly.
Okay, I'm actually not quite sure I fully understand the first question. Now, I mean, you know, I'm not sure I'm responding to the question, but let me attempt. I think the, you know, a criticism that is frequently leveled at material consumption as a measure of resource efficiency is that we're lumping together, you know, a lot of very, very different things. We're lumping together sand and gravel, which are essentially inert and don't produce, you know, a lot of environmental impacts if they're disposed sort of in nature, with very toxic things such as arsenic and mercury, for instance. So yeah, that is clearly a weakness in lumping, you know, in the indicator in a way. I mean, the indicator suffers from that weakness. And you would actually need to decompose the indicator maybe into, you know, sort of low environmental impact fractions and high environmental impact fractions to see, you know, how, you know, how we're potentially decreasing material use that then also leads to a decrease in environmental impacts. So I'm not sure, you know, that was exactly the question. Anyway, that's the answer that I'm giving. And how to create incentives to use materials which are suitable for recovery. Well, I think I've sort of given that answer in my talk because ultimately, you know, landfill taxes, extended producer responsibility, any measure that essentially leads to making material recovery economically viable will do so, you know, repeatedly. And so I don't think I need to say maybe more than that than what I have already said.
Thanks, Peter. We have another question here that asks you to expand perhaps on the mix of policy instruments that address the challenge. You identified some policy instruments as you went through. You talked about landfill taxes a lot and things like extended producer responsibility. Do you have any kind of world-leading examples of where a package is being put together? Are there any poster countries that you'd like to hold up as a kind of a final point? As
well, I think certainly no one is perfect. And it's always difficult and a bit delicate to sort of put particular countries sort of at the fore, especially as the policies in this area are still sort of under development and there's a lot of experimentation going on. But certainly, I mean, my sense is that with the circular economy package that the EU is putting forward, a lot of new terrain is being explored and sort of yeah, being expanded in by these policies now, and I think that in a way the circular economy package reflects the past to the extent that you have a lot of sort of regulatory and economic instruments that are available and that are being further strengthened in the package on the end of life side. And then a whole array of different new initiatives, usually not with the same strong regulatory and you know backup as on the waste side, which are now being implemented in a or may be implemented actually in a more exploratory way in order to help and decrease material use, prevent more waste, and provide incentives for better product designs. So yeah, I mean it's very difficult to identify the stars in such a general way. I mean I think there are policies in specific areas, such as how do you prevent planned obsolescence and provide incentives for the design of products that last longer, and then I think there are a number of measures that are being implemented by a number of countries that could be identified, but sort of across the board it's more difficult.
Okay, we'll take one final question from our participants in the webinar. And this is actually take us into a new area. This is we're seeing a huge trend towards new types of organisation, like the sharing economy, the rise of Uber and Airbnb. What kind of a role do you think these are going to play in improving resource efficiency going forward?
Okay, well
that's a good question, and it is in fact a question that we want to focus on a little bit in the future here. So I think the short answer is we don't know, because there are very different business models that are available that are new, such as the sharing economy. There are also business models which are so-called product services business models, where companies, instead of selling a product, sell a service, such as rather than selling a chemical, they're selling the service that comes from the chemical, and so there's a diversity of different approaches. I think all of us sense that there could be some potential in them in supporting circular economy objectives or resource efficiency objectives, but it's not clear. I mean, I don't think we have clearly mapped out the new business models that hold some promise from a circular economy perspective. We don't know what the environmental benefits of those new business models might actually be. And finally, we don't know what the policies are to actually support the emergence and the scale up of those business models that might be the most virtuous ones from a circular economy objective. Just think of car sharing, which is one of the business models that is often being talked about. I think there, and it's one of those that has been studied in much more depth than others, and the results here in terms of what are the environmental benefits of car sharing are relatively consistent across the literature. So you essentially replace 3 or 4, private cars, by every car or shared car in the car sharing system, and people drive less. So that is a very positive effect. But then what about the second order effects? What will people then do with the money that they've saved? Will they buy tickets to fly out, on long distance trips, or will they, buy a little patch of land and grow tomatoes next to where they live? And then, this is where the effects are going to be very, very different. So I think there's clearly more research needed to understand, the effects on the environment that these new business models are generating. Some reflection about the second order effects, and certainly a lot of thinking about what the policy levers are actually going to be to support some of those business models.
Okay, thanks Peter, and thanks everyone for participating today. I'd like to thank you very much for your talk and for answering the questions, both from the floor here and from our participants on the webinar. Our next talk is on the 6th of July, where we're going to have the topic, what wobbled the Paris Agreement on shipping? And we'll be joined by our expert from the International Transport Forum to discuss that. So thanks again. Thanks to all the participants on the webinar, and we look forward to having you join us on the next Green Talk. Cheers.